So, who would like to start off?
Andrew Ross from Global Garden. It's really a question for Pieter. Are you engaging the financial sector in all of your discussions? You can see the Aviva roadmap as a way in which the EU non-financial reporting directive and integrated reporting is now becoming mainstream, and the green bond market is booming. Is the financial community as a total, with its $100 trillion turnover, getting the message at all?
I'm not sure if the $100 trillion turnover is getting this message, but a section of it is. How are we connecting to the finance sector? Well, first, there are participants in the Natural Capital Coalition. A major actor in our work is the International Finance Corporation, which is the private sector branch of the World Bank. But we've also just signed a memorandum of understanding with the Natural Capital Declaration. This natural capital world is a place full of three-letter organizations. We are the NCC, there's an NCC here, and there's the NCD. We've signed an MOU with them because finance sector is going to be very important. We've seen it in climate change. The moment the financial sector understood the risks of climate and carbon, it started to ask of business to start to account for that and share that information with them. Natural capital, or ecosystem degradation, is a risk for companies that are dependent on them. And the financial sector is starting to understand this too. It's going to be a slower process. The 5 to 7 year time horizon is actually very long for business. That's called a long-term investment in finance. I used to work for an investment management firm. Time horizons are usually much, much shorter, actually, within business, within the finance sector. So natural capital could actually help there too. The focus right now will be on what we would call the social responsible investment divisions of all financial institutions that are looking for the portfolios for people that would like to have a little bit more of a green or social lining on their investment portfolios.
Thanks, Pieter. Question there, yeah.
James Hebron-Scott from Forest Carbon Limited, probably the smallest organisation represented in the room. It's a question for Ulrike, please. You showed a very good slide which featured the Southwest Water and the West Country Rivers Trust, where there's a huge amount of good stuff going on down there. On that slide, you also showed there was a little logo for the Woodland Carbon Code, which may not be familiar to many people in here, but it's a great piece of work and it's delivering really good work on the ground. Would you be able, Ulrike, to say a little bit to the audience about what that code is doing already to restore and build natural capital here in the UK, and what Defra is or could do to promote its activity and enable it to deliver even more and faster?
Do you mean you meant the peatland code? Did you?
No, I actually meant the Woodland Carbon Code, which featured on your slide.
Yes.
You might have mentioned the peatland code too, which is a little bit younger and in early days, but is coming on quickly.
The advantage of the peatland code is that I can say something about it. Well, I can't say anything about the woodland code, but there might be other people in the audience who can. The peatland code was, if you don't mind, I say a little bit about that, and perhaps somebody else can think about the woodland code in the meantime. That was launched in 2013, and it builds on 2 of the Defra pilots. That's why I think it's really important. It's an 18-month pilot phase in cooperation with Defra. It provides a basis for business to sponsor peatland restoration, and it has an initial suite of shovel-ready, as we call these things, restoration project identified and covering over 25,000 hectares worth of blanket bogland. And it helps to raise awareness with business because they know of the ecosystem services provided by peatland, such as climate regulation, water purification, etc. So in this case, the actual asset is not changed, so the peatland itself is not changed, but business can actually make money out of the services that are provided to society from the peatland. And I think that is the interesting concept. If you think of the water example, which was also on the slide with the pretty landscape and the river flowing through it, there the water companies can pay for the cleaning process that is provided by nature as an ecosystem service, which is then, of course, reduces their costs of cleaning the water themselves. In the peatland case, the example is slightly different because you don't end up with a marketed project, with a marketed product. Sorry, it's been a long day. So you don't end up with that marketable product, but companies still end up with being able to make money out of this project. That's why I think there's a difference in those, and that's why I wanted to point out both of them. You look troubled now.
If I might take a small issue, this wasn't my question, but you answered very well a different one, Ulrike, but you did say that the point about the peatland code was that the peatland wasn't changed. I would submit that the whole point is the peatland is changed. The peatlands the code is looking at are damaged peatlands, and the code is about enabling businesses to help restoring those peatlands. That's hugely important. And the principle is additionality. It's going to happen anyway. There's no benefit. This is about making restoration happen that couldn't happen otherwise.
I think what I meant is that the ecosystem service provided by water purification services is something that can flow directly into the balance sheet of a company. That's what I meant. And I think that is the difference to the peatland code. You see what I mean? Kind of. Anybody come up with an idea for the woodland code? No.
No. Oh, yes. We have an offer. It's like an auction.
Yes.
Well, the Woodland Carbon Code was one of the things that when I was sitting on the Ecosystem Markets Task Force identified as one of the ways, and I highlighted in my talk this morning about the fact that that was significant opportunities of economic benefit. So I think that in terms of what can be done to encourage it, which I think really is what your question is, what we need more businesses like Kingfisher Group who have used B&Q to actually say that they will now be sourcing some of their products like charcoal and whatnot from forests and woodlands that actually meet the Woodland Carbon Code standard. There are significant opportunities, particularly for wood fuel and wood fuel derived products from better managed woodland, and the Woodland Carbon Code is designed to tell landowners how they can go about managing their woodland, both to deliver more product but also to deliver more biodiversity and other benefits, including the carbon benefits. So I think the issue is actually around businesses need to start, and procurers, who we got lampooned earlier, need to actually be aware of this and use it in the way that they specify what they need, and that's the way we could actually trigger bringing a lot of currently neglected woodland into far higher biodiversity status and also higher economic benefit.
Great, thanks very much for jumping in there. That's really helpful. Another question? Yes, down just in front of you. Yeah.
Hi, Edward Maltby. Since it's come up upstream thinking as a pathfinder. I mean, what's particularly interesting about that is that the ability of South West Water to actually put money into restoration and, if you like, the maintenance or enhancement of natural capital was predicated on the fact that their survey of customers revealed a willingness to pay, and more importantly, that the regulator, Ofwat, permitted some proportion of that willingness to pay to be used for this purpose. So the key policy change was to move away from the polluter pays principle to the fact that the consumer was willing to pick up some of the costs of achieving a benefit which long-term meant that they would have more sustainable and cheaper water in the long term. And I think that's a very interesting change in thinking and an example of how we have to start rethinking exactly how we match the desired objectives to how society will support the mechanisms.
Thank you. Yes.
Anybody wish to comment further on that on the panel here? They're all ignoring me now. No. Okay, another question, please. Yes, down at the front here.
Tony Allen again, King's College. I'm finding the discussion a bit politically light in that what I've discovered through decades of trying to engage in this cycle, early on as an environmental scientist and then learning a lot of economics as well, was that these are the underlying fundamentals that people, that society and business and all the other folks should comply with and recognize, but they don't. Now, that seems to be the current thinking here, that there are lots of things we should do, but the politics of getting them done is the important part, and I would like to have thought there would be some reflection of that in the panel, in that the problem with just assuming that society with a bit of enthusiasm and government with a bit of enthusiasm and the private sector with a bit of enthusiasm will do things is not really justified, because we found that it doesn't work that way. When I asked an earlier question of Richard, of whom I'm now a devoted fan, I asked him, was the accounting industry prepared to come in as a lead? And no, he immediately went back thinking, no, it's not us. So who is it? I mean, we need to understand, not just, I loved the numbers, Joe, but we really need to know what are the politics, the inertia of the market power, the inertia of government power. How do we engage with that? They may come to meetings, but we really need to understand the details and the granularity of how that gets done, in my view.
I think that's a really excellent question, actually. Last week we had an event run by the Scottish Forum on Natural Capital, and Gary Gillespie, who's the chief economist I mentioned before, who's one of the steering group, came and spoke at that event. And he is clearly speaking from a civil service point of view rather than a ministerial perspective. But I think it's true to say that the debate in Scotland has gained real traction in both of those parts of the political world, both in terms of the civil servants that we work with and right up to the First Minister who attended the World Forum last year. One of the things that Gary said was we need to get natural capital metrics into the National Performance Framework. I think ultimately what this is about is aligning priorities. So that's the aim of the Scottish Forum, and I think to get political buy-in, politicians listen to business leaders. We've seen that from the discussions that we've had. Obviously, they listen to voters. That's probably a harder thing to achieve, but the more people switch on the television and see flooding and so on, the easier it becomes to say, well, look, from a government perspective, protecting wetlands is going to help protect the population from, some of the worst effects of flooding. I think it's about aligning priorities. The Natural Capital Asset Index that I alluded to earlier, which is being developed, ultimately, if that can underpin government decision-making so that we're making businesses see the relevance of their actions impacting, it's a complicated process, but the interest is there.
Can I just have a quick supplement? An example of what is a problem. Cheap food is the problem. Governments can't afford to contradict society that wants and has got used to cheap food. Food prices have been falling for 100 years, certainly over the past 60. This is terrible for the environment. And business also is proud of being able to deliver cheap food. We can see the crazy thing that's going on. These are the power, these are the energies that you're trying to confront. We need to understand those energies first.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that Gary Gillespie said actually himself was that governments can't achieve everything. We had a similar question, and he said, there are millions of interactions in the economy all the time, so we've got to have this multi-pronged approach because governments can't solve the whole problem. But I think IUCN is key in this. I mean, the membership of IUCN is made up of a lot of member states. Legislators are increasingly engaging with this through natural capital summits of their own. So, yes, it has to happen.
Yeah. Private sector is much more involved.
I think everybody has to be part of the solution, to be honest.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Pieter?
There isn't a simple political answer to your question. If we look at what drives business, and you've mentioned one, it's being able to offer products at low prices so that you can increase your consumer base. There's a few things that motivate business. One, there is the fear for regulation. It motivates business sometimes to move ahead, to go ahead and try to stay ahead of that regulation. It's called regulatory rent-seeking, and hope that regulation never appears. There is the fear for the consumer, but the consumer is hardly as rational as we would hope. I think we should all realize that by now, because the consumer has so much information to deal with when it stands in front of a place where it can buy something, to understand what all the factors are that's influencing the production of that product. The other big motivator is opportunity and the ability to cut costs. And yes, there are opportunities for companies to invest in a natural system because it's cheaper than building up a big plant to purify water. Those opportunities are there too. Risk is a really big driver because it excites the financial industry, which business is very much dependent on. So the moment risks become exposed, you have a very important driver that will drive business to move forward much faster. But you'll need the financial sector to act on those risks, to think they're important, to understand how important they are. And we haven't reached that point yet where that information is clear within that financial sector. You can also have some leadership in companies. You can have the CEO who's completely motivated moving his company forward. And when that CEO leaves, which is usually now within a 3 or 4 year cycle, we find out how many of his staff really believed in that mission, or if his successor believed in that mission. So in the end, we need that system. You need the regulatory threat. You need the financial system to start to understand those risks and start to ask to mitigate them. You need to find out what the opportunities are, the investment opportunities, and you need the ability for the consumer to understand what he is or he is not buying. In the Netherlands, there's an initiative called True Price. Here we have True Cost. There's an initiative called True Price. That by calculating the values of impacts, and you put that price label on a product, the consumer immediately understands what it's really costing that consumer. Again, a very complex thing for consumers to consider because you have the real price, that's the one you pay, and you have the one that you also pay but not immediately listed on that product. But it's an interesting way of looking at selling products. If it's about natural systems and our use of natural resources, that's where we should focus on. How are our products made? Where are they sourced? What's the effect of that sourcing? And how are we impacting through the use, through the entire life cycle of that product, the natural systems we are part of? So that's also where we need to focus on getting that leadership. How do we get those products to become those sustainable products that we look for? And that's an impossible debate because it requires systems thinking, not one leader, not one government saying A or B, not one civil society person yelling at the door. It requires everyone to sort of have all the bits in place moving us forward. And maybe we as humans are not up to that task, and then we'll go extinct. And that's just how it will be. Yeah.
There's not really much to add, and as a civil servant, I can't give a political answer either. But just perhaps one additional point, which is important for governments, is the impact on government budgets. And if you think about the links between the natural environment and health, I think we are slowly coming to a point where it's realized that a lot of the, if I may just call it abuse because of a word, abuse of the natural environment has a negative impact on people's health, which at least in this country has a direct impact on budgets, on what happens to the NHS, etc. I think that might be something where then you get the political actors more engaged. But if that is what is needed, if that is what you meant. But of course I cannot give a political answer. But I thought Pieter's answer was pretty comprehensive.
Great, thanks Ulrike for that. Okay, there's a question in the third row there in the middle.
Hello, my name's Steve Venton, and I'm just here independently, but I'd like to ask Pieter, in particular, one of the big challenges that business obviously faces is the internalisation of the negative externalities that we face. And I'm really curious to understand a little bit more about how the protocol might, I understand it's very early days, but it might face that challenge and help companies that adopt it to be more profitable than those that don't.
Yes, I'm curious to find out how the protocol is going to do that too. But that is the core of what we're trying to achieve. Not the sustainability team needs more information on what the environmental impacts are and what the environmental dependencies are. It's the CFO who looks at the balance sheet, who looks at the profit and loss statements, who looks at the forecasts that he's dealing with, who is discounting stuff. It's that CFO that needs to get the information that will help him decide where the investments go to. It's that board level where we need to go. It's operations. It's the person in the plant deciding where to buy or where not to buy, or where to situate a particular production process. That needs that information. And right now, the way business is organized, I've been in a business, you do a business case, and you value everything, and you get a plus or a minus at the end. And if we can get to that point, that's ethically responsible. If we can get to that point, it's the easiest way forward. We probably won't get there though. So we also need to transform business management into taking on board some of the more softer values. And that's also what the protocol is aiming for to achieve in the next 17 months that we have left. So that business, and that's where we need accounting too, because we need those new principles and those new ideas, so that business cannot feel soft about making very difficult decisions because they haven't fully grasped what the impact will be, the profit and loss statement.
Thanks. Mary Christie, Scottish Natural Heritage. I've just been thinking, I didn't go to the session this morning on linking natural capital with social capital and other capitals, but it strikes me that a lot of what we're talking about, we're kind of saying, well, you know, the problem that's left is natural capital. But quite a lot of people might say social problems with social capital and human capital might be equally valid to talk about. So should we not, as a kind of community, whether it's in whichever situation that we find ourselves, also be collaborating with those who are more concerned about social and human capital? If so, how do we do that?
Yes, I agree with you there. And if I'm not mistaken, the Economic and Social Research Council is just launching a project. I think they call it the Nexus. I fear there are more than one Nexus around, but Ian Bateman from the University of East Anglia is leading this work. He's also a member of the Natural Capital Committee, where we are looking first at the nexus between water, food, etc., production. We are looking at what kind of information do we need in government to do the analysis that I talked about earlier, the appraisal of different policy options. And at that, we also want to start discussing this issue of social capital that could be a subform of, or a part of human capital. We just need to discuss that in more depth. The social researcher or the head of social research in Defra and I have been discussing this at some length, because the whole debate about behavior change and how behavior change can be achieved, I think, is to some extent around social capital and what that means for the economy and for society. So it's definitely a yes to your question, but also it's not easy, and we are right at the beginning of that.
Yeah, I'm barely getting my head around natural capital, but I do know one of my great partners at the World Business Council announced, I think it was Tuesday, that they are moving forward on social capital in their redefining value program. So things are happening, I do know this, and maybe that's a place where you can go to find out what they're doing, but that's very much business oriented and not maybe the multi-stakeholder type forum that I currently manage, where multiple stakeholder groups are there. I don't know much further about it, I just heard the announcement.
Yeah. Probably just worth mentioning, actually, I do think it's an incredibly important issue. That's one of the reasons that we're working with the Green Economy Coalition around the development of the Natural Capital Charter. So I think it's key that natural capital doesn't develop in isolation from other forms of capital, but also from other emerging concepts such as the circular economy, which is also being factored into the work that we're doing.
Hello, my name's Nick Grayson. I'm from Birmingham, and I'm very keen to see whether or not the panel members would be keen to work with a pioneer city, because I think everything that's been discussed so far, make it real for people. Let's do it in cities. And I think all that's been said translates to cities, and that's the direction of travel we're taking. I'm just interested in your views and whether or not you'd be interested in having perhaps another category to the protocol.
I think it seems to be a question for Pieter.
No, for all three.
No,
well, the government's chief scientific advisor is running a number of future, what are they called? Some kind of horizon scanning programs. And there's one that is called the Future of Cities. And at the beginning, there was a bit of a surprise when I asked whether Defra could take part in that work. And I'm now on that group to look at cities and the natural environment, or the environment that people live in, and how that impacts on well-being of people within cities, and also how it impacts on the economy and how we could develop that in the future, etc., etc. So there's that work program has just started.
I was just going to say, I'm aware that there's some exciting work happening in Birmingham. I mean, the World Forum on Natural Capital is really an opportunity to showcase good practice and you know, share learning. So that's one option. Edinburgh itself launched an initiative a couple of days ago that the Scottish Wildlife Trust is involved in, called the Edinburgh Living Landscape. There are some really interesting examples from all over the world. So I think cities is a key focus. Green infrastructure is increasing in importance all the time.
Yeah, on the specific question, there should be a sector guide for cities. Difficult one, because it's such a different type of environment than a company. One of the big priorities I have, and the Natural Capital Coalition that we do have, is that what we do not want is natural capital valuation or accounting systems that are being developed at the governmental level, or at the sub-government or the local level, do not match with what we're doing. So we really need to bring those together, and we are going to have discussions with some governments soon, in December, that's very soon, on how to bring those two into some form of collaborative work. Because in the end, we could be working with two different systems and the two will never meet. And then that system approach will never take place. But for the Natural Capital Coalition, which is business focused, that's a difficult one. But I do know at the World Bank level, this is happening, and that's also being translated to the local level. And Defra is doing a lot, but we do need to bring them together.
So that leaves me with the very pleasurable job of thanking once again the three speakers. It's been a very informative afternoon. I also feel very inspired that such big progress is on the way. Okay, we're not there yet with a lot of things, but to actually be on the way in so many big initiatives that we've heard about this afternoon, to me, is very inspiring. So thank you to all of you for contributing to the discussions, and please thank me once again to the three afternoon speakers for some fantastic talks.